a shadow appearing at noon when none should exist. Welcome to Silent Case File. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I read them all. Let's chase this impossible mystery together. It was in the spring of 1893, when the streets of London had just begun to shake off the final frost of winter, that I found myself once again ensconced in the familiar sitting room of 220 Baker Street. The gaslight cast a golden glow upon the cluttered tables, and a thin plume of tobacco smoke coiled languidly in the air. Holmes was at his violin, teasing out a mournful Hungarian air, as if coaxing a memory from its slumber. I had barely finished setting down the morning edition of the Times when a peculiar interruption broke the lull of the afternoon. The bell rang, twice, then once more. "That," Holmes said, placing his bow gently on the table, "is the knock of a man in distress, but not of panic. 3 knocks, unevenly spaced. Expect urgency restrained by formality, Watson. Do be so good as to open the door." When I answered, I beheld a tall gentleman in his late 40s, expensively but conservatively dressed in the manner of a barrister or civil servant. His moustache was neatly trimmed, but his eyes, a piercing grey, betrayed a man who had not slept well in days. In one gloved hand he held a bowler hat, in the other a slim leather portfolio. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, scanning me quickly. I assured him I was not, and gestured for him to enter. Holmes, with the studied languor of a man well aware of his own reputation, remained seated in his armchair. "I presume," he said before the gentleman could speak, "that you have travelled from the southern quarter of the city. The faint scent of camphor suggests proximity to a medical district, Camberwell or Lambeth perhaps. You've changed coaches recently, judging by the streaks of dried mud on your boots over the older, paler layer beneath." The gentleman blinked. "Quite right. Lambeth, by way of Blackfriars Bridge." Holmes inclined his head modestly. "Please, sir, state your case." The visitor sat, opened his portfolio, and withdrew a single page, folded in half, then in quarters. He passed it to Holmes without a word. I leaned forward to glimpse its contents, a map, hand-drawn, of a small urban square and the adjacent buildings. On it, a single X was inked in red beside the words 1203, the shadow, seen at noon. Holmes studied it for no more than 5 seconds. "And your name, sir?" "Edgar P. Winstanley. I serve as private secretary to Sir Alton Beresford, Member of Parliament for Southwark East." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Sir Alton, prominent in reformist circles, last year's inquiry into prison conditions, and a vehement critic of the Metropolitan Police, if memory serves." "The very same. He is also, I regret to say, quite possibly in mortal danger." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And this shadow seen at noon, a threat?" Winstanley nodded gravely. "Yesterday, at precisely 12 minutes past noon, a man was seen standing in the internal courtyard of Sir Alton's private residence. He was dressed in black, motionless, observing the drawing-room window. When approached by a servant, he vanished, quite literally. No trace. The house was searched. Nothing." "And this was not the first occurrence?" "No, Mr. Holmes, it was the second. The first time was 3 days ago. The same time, the same posture, the same inexplicable disappearance." Holmes tapped the map with a forefinger. "And the X marks the shadow's position." "Indeed." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "no footprints, no evidence of passage. Intriguing." Winstanley hesitated, then added, "Sir Alton has received anonymous notes, one each morning this week, short, cryptic phrases. Today's read simply, 'He waits at the hour of judgment.'" Holmes rose suddenly, striding to the window and drawing the curtain aside. The sunlight outside had begun its descent, casting long, angular shadows across Baker Street. A man seen only in daylight, yet vanishing as if consumed by the night. "Mr. Winstanley, this case has the markings of a rare delight." He turned, eyes gleaming. "Watson, we are to visit Lambeth. Prepare your revolver. I sense this mystery will not be resolved without confrontation." As we gathered our things, I could not shake the chill that had settled upon me, a figure appearing like clockwork, shadows at noon, and the strange certainty that danger now clung to us as we stepped into London's quiet maze. Holmes and I rode south in a hansom cab, the city blurring past in streaks of soot and sunlight as we made our way to Lambeth. Winstanley sat across from us, silent but visibly tense, his eyes occasionally flitting to the map, now folded in his coat pocket. Holmes, meanwhile, reclined with his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, eyes half closed, yet I knew from experience that he missed nothing. The cadence of hooves, the flicker of nervous glances, the direction of the wind. He was absorbing the world, filtering it through his ever-turning mind. "Winstanley," Holmes said suddenly, without opening his eyes, "tell me again about the layout of the courtyard. I want your precise memory of the sighting." Winstanley nodded. "It's a rectangular space, narrow, enclosed on 3 sides by the house itself. The 4th is bounded by a high brick wall separating Sir Alton's property from the next. There's only one gate leading into it, which was locked. The housekeeper swears it remained so the entire time. No roof access. Only from inside the house via a servant's staircase leading to the attic. But no one heard footsteps, and even if someone used it, they would have had to descend into the courtyard without alerting anyone." "Describe the figure," Holmes said. "Height, posture, clothing, any movement." He stood still, utterly so. Tall, perhaps 6 feet, dressed all in black. He wore a hat, brim pulled low. His face was obscured. I didn't see it myself, but the housemaid who did said he never moved, not even when she shouted. Then she ran to fetch help, and when she returned, he was gone. "Vanishing phantoms at midday," Holmes murmured. "Not the usual fare for a sitting member of Parliament." "And you're certain these visitations occur precisely at noon?" 12 minutes past noon, to be exact," Winstanley corrected. "Both times." Holmes opened his eyes at that, and a faint glimmer of interest lit their grey depths. A detail not to be overlooked. Most precision in such matters is illusion, but repetition suggests intention. We arrived at Sir Alton's townhouse just as the bells of a nearby chapel began tolling the hour. A butler received us with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, ushering us through a stately foyer into the drawing-room where Sir Alton Beresford awaited us. He was a man of commanding presence, with iron-grey hair and a face carved with long years of debate and discontent. His eyes, however, lacked their reputed fire. They were haggard, haunted. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted stiffly. "You come highly recommended. I trust Winstanley has given you the facts?" "He has, Sir Alton," Holmes replied, bowing slightly. "Though I find facts are often shy creatures, one must coax them into the open." Sir Alton gave a mirthless chuckle. "You'll find little humour in this house of late. Come, I'll show you the place myself." We followed him down a narrow corridor and out through a rear door that opened onto the courtyard. It was as Winstanley had described, a brick-walled enclosure of perhaps 25 feet by 15, with ivy trailing the western wall and a single wrought-iron gate at the far end, locked and rusted. The grass underfoot was sparse and damp. A small sundial sat in the centre, casting a thin shadow that had already begun its afternoon crawl. Holmes moved silently across the space, examining every angle. He crouched by the gate, pressed his fingers to the lock, then paced back to the sundial. He looked up. "The maid saw him standing here?" he asked. Yes, Sir Alton confirmed. Exactly there, by the sundial. Holmes nodded and glanced at the surrounding walls. "Watson," he said, "your opinion? If a man were to climb from one of those upper windows, could he land without a sound?" I peered upward. The second story was not particularly high, but the courtyard's echoing acoustics meant even a whisper might carry. "Perhaps," I said, "but only with considerable skill and daring." "Just so," Holmes replied. He withdrew a small lens from his coat and began to examine the stonework near the base of the wall. After a minute, he gave a soft, satisfied grunt and rose. "Sir Alton," he said, "these anonymous notes may,
I see them." The politician hesitated, then gestured for Winstanley to fetch them. When he returned, Holmes took the thin stack of folded papers and laid them across the sundial. He examined the penmanship, then held the topmost page up to the light. "No watermark," he said. "Paper of average stock. Ink consistent across all pages, black, moderate pressure, fine nib. The handwriting, however, is not average. It is deliberately plain, constructed to mimic unremarkable script. Look here, Watson. See how the loops on the G's and Y's are slightly off balance, as if written by someone used to more flourish." I leaned in and saw what he meant. The letters had a strange stiffness, a sense of disguise about them. "Do they mean anything to you?" I asked. "Only that they were written by someone clever enough to suppress their natural hand. That in itself is telling." He turned to Sir Alton. "And your enemies, sir? Surely a man in your position has collected a few." Sir Alton gave a weary sigh. "Too many to count. Reformists make few friends in high places, but this is something else. I feel watched, Mr. Holmes, hunted, and yet I do not know by whom or why." Holmes walked to the gate once more, pressed his fingers against the rusted latch and frowned. A locked gate, a shadow without a source, a warning from an invisible hand. It's all very theatrical. He turned suddenly, his eyes sharp. "There's a window overlooking this courtyard, north side. May I inspect it?" Sir Alton nodded, and moments later we were inside the house again, ascending a back staircase to a narrow study with a high, arched window. Holmes threw it open and leaned out, studying the ground below. "Interesting," he muttered. "Very interesting." He pulled back in and gestured to the small desk in the corner. "Whose room is this?" "Mine," Winstanley replied. "It's where I prepare correspondence and handle Sir Alton's records." Holmes nodded absently. He scanned the room, books, folders, pens, and then focused on a blotter pad atop the desk. He held it to the light. "Watson, come see." There, faintly impressed into the paper, were the words, "He waits at the hour of judgment." Holmes's face darkened. "Someone wrote the last note here, in this room." Winstanley paled. "That's not possible. I've never—" Holmes silenced him with a raised hand. "We are no longer dealing with simple threats," he said quietly. "There is a hand at work in this house, hiding in plain sight. And unless I am mistaken, we have until tomorrow at 12 minutes past noon to uncover it, before the shadow, seen at noon, becomes something far more tangible." With that he turned on his heel and strode from the room, leaving Winstanley and me to exchange anxious glances. The game, as ever, was afoot. We descended the narrow staircase in silence, Holmes moving quickly, his long strides purposeful. He paused only once, at a spot on the landing, where a patch of plaster had begun to crack, and pressed his palm to the wall with a thoughtful frown before continuing downward. Sir Alton had retired to the study, claiming the weight of parliamentary affairs, leaving Winstanley, Holmes, and myself to return to the drawing-room. The tension in the house seemed to cling like dust, and I could not shake the sense
that we were walking among actors mid-performance, each concealing more than they revealed. Holmes lit a cigarette and stood by the hearth, eyes narrowed against the rising smoke. "Winstanley," he said at last, "tell me who besides yourself and Sir Alton has access to the study." Winstanley hesitated. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Cribben, enters to clean in the morning. The maid, Ellen, brings letters or tea-trays. And, well, Sir Alton's nephew, Henry Beresford, occasionally borrows books from the shelf." Holmes's gaze flickered. "Henry Beresford? He lives here?" "He has a room on the 3rd floor," Winstanley replied. "He's young, barely 20, bit of an idealist. Sir Alton's taken him under his wing, politically speaking." "And his movements?" Winstanley looked uncertain. "He keeps odd hours, attends meetings, some political, others social, I suspect. He was in the house both days the figure appeared, but swears he saw nothing." Holmes murmured. "Odd hours, access to the study, and a cause that might benefit from disruption or drama." "You suspect him?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "I suspect everyone, but I trust no one." He dropped the cigarette into the fireplace and turned to Winstanley. "Fetch him. I should like to speak to young Mr. Beresford now, before the clock brings us closer to tomorrow's confrontation." Winstanley left, and moments later returned with a tall, wiry young man with fair hair and intense blue eyes. Henry Beresford moved with the restless energy of youth, but there was something guarded in his manner as he greeted us. "You're the detective," he said. "Come to sort out the spook in the garden?" Holmes gestured to a chair. "Sit, Mr. Beresford. I understand you've seen nothing unusual despite the household's mounting unease." "Nothing but nerves and shadows," he said, shrugging. "Honestly, I think it's all a bit overblown. The maid sees someone and screams, then we're all told there's a phantom stalking the yard." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "But you were here, in the house, at the times in question?" "Upstairs, yes. I was writing letters on Monday, and yesterday I was sleeping off a rather long night." "And you didn't hear any disturbance?" "A bit of shouting. I assumed Ellen had seen a rat." Holmes studied him in silence for a moment. "And your interest in your uncle's political work, sincere or dutiful?" Henry raised his eyebrows. "Both, I suppose. I believe in reform. I believe in transparency. And I believe some of my uncle's enemies wouldn't mind seeing him embarrassed, or worse." "That last remark is rather specific," Holmes said softly, "because I've seen some of the letters. One of them mentioned final reckoning. That's not political disagreement, that's something darker." Holmes nodded slowly, then stood. "Thank you, Mr. Beresford. That will be all for now, but do not leave the house." Henry left, and Winstanley looked to Holmes, his brow furrowed. "Do you believe him?" "Partially," Holmes replied. "He lies by omission, but the young often do, out of pride more than malice." He moved toward the window again, drawing back the curtain and staring into the empty courtyard below. The sundial's shadow had grown long and jagged, splitting the stone into uneven halves. "There is something about this case," he murmured, "that reminds me of illusionists I once saw in Paris. The trick lies not in what the eye sees, but in what it is meant to overlook." "Then what is it we're overlooking?" I asked. Holmes tapped the glass lightly. "The courtyard is closed, the figure vanishes, the message appears, and no one sees the moment of insertion. That suggests the answer lies not in entry or exit, but in timing and in perception." He turned to Winstanley. "You said Ellen saw the figure and ran for help?" "Yes." "She left the window, ran down to the kitchen and called for the butler. When they returned, less than 2 minutes later, the figure was gone. And in that time she took her eyes off the scene. Of course." Holmes's smile was grim. then our shadow needs only a moment to vanish, a moment when the watcher ceases to observe. He strode from the room without another word, and we followed him down the hallway, past the stair, and through a door I had not noticed before, a pantry converted into a tool room. He examined the walls, the wooden shelving, the faint scent of oil and damp iron. Then he stopped. A floorboard, looser than the others. He crouched, pulled out his penknife, and pried it up with a soft creak. Beneath, nestled among cobwebs and dust, lay a narrow compartment, empty save for a length of black cloth and a small, cylindrical spyglass. He held them up to the light. The cloth was coarse, heavy linen dyed a deep black. The glass, of fine make, bore a tiny engraving. W. Mortimer, optician, Borough High Street. A disguise, Holmes said, and an implement for watching unseen. But who used them? I asked. That, my dear Watson, he replied, is the question we must answer tonight. He tucked the items away in his coat and lowered the board gently into place. As we returned to the drawing room, the housekeeper appeared, wiping her hands on her apron and looking flushed. Beg pardon, Mr. Winstanley, there's a man at the door asking for Mr. Holmes.
Says it's urgent. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did he give a name? Said he was a friend of Mr. Henry's. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Bring him in. Moments later, a wiry man of perhaps 30 was shown into the room. His clothes were respectable but creased, his eyes red-rimmed, his manner agitated. I'm sorry to intrude, he said, glancing around nervously. But something's happened. I didn't know who else to tell. And you are? Holmes asked. Peter Langham. Henry and I are acquaintances from the Reform Society. What has happened? Langham swallowed. I was on Borough High Street this morning. I stopped at Mortimer's. That's where Henry bought the spyglass. He paid cash, didn't give a name. But I saw someone follow me out. Tall, black coat, hat low. I tried to shake him, but he vanished into a side alley. Holmes said nothing, but his eyes gleamed with sudden light. Watson, he said briskly, we are nearly there. Then to Langham. You've brought us the final piece of the puzzle, Mr. Langham, whether you realize it or not. He turned toward the window once more. Tomorrow, he said softly, the shadow returns. But next time we shall be watching it, not the other way around. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet hum of preparation. Holmes, once returned from a brief visit to the gatekeeper's cottage with the spyglass and cloth concealed beneath his coat, moved with increasing intensity, as though the pieces of the puzzle had at last formed a discernible pattern in his mind. He requested candles to be brought to the attic, inspected the inner locks on each of the ground floor doors, and conferred with me privately in the study while Winstanley and the others waited below. There is something theatrical in this entire arrangement, Holmes murmured, pacing the floor slowly. A man appears at 12 minutes past noon in an enclosed courtyard. No trace of entry or exit. Anonymous notes with biblical gravitas, and now a connection to Mr. Henry Beresford, who speaks too carefully and whose friend brings us more than he realizes. You think the notes are from Henry? I asked. Possibly. But even if he did not write them, someone close to him did. The spyglass confirms surveillance. It was used not merely to observe the courtyard, but to observe its observers, likely from that upper window. And the cloth? A simple prop. The man seen in black, the shadow, is a creation. A figure who stands in the light to imply darkness. An illusion, Watson, but with deadly intent behind it. Mark my words, tomorrow will not be another performance. It will be the culmination. I studied Holmes's face in the dim light. He was focused, cold, a man on the edge of revelation. I had seen this look before, once in Dartmoor, once in Sussex, and it always preceded an unveiling that left others
breathless. Holmes turned abruptly to the door. "Come, we must speak to Ellen, the maid." We found her in the kitchen, drying silverware. She was a slight young woman, fair-haired, with a timidity about her that suggested she had been raised to avoid drawing attention. At Holmes's questioning, she answered plainly, but not without fear. I saw him, sir. Both times. He stood there, still as stone. Right by the sundial, I ran for help, and when I came back with Mr. Winstanley, he was gone. Did you see where he went? No, sir, that's the strange part. There wasn't even time for him to leave, I thought. And yet you never saw him walk, climb, or even shift position? No, sir, he didn't move. It were like he'd just appeared. Holmes nodded gently. And you never saw the figure's face? No, the hat shadowed it. Holmes thanked her and led us back upstairs. He said nothing until we reached the second floor once more, then turned to me sharply. She described the figure as unmoving, a trick of presence, not behaviour. Think, Watson, what stands still in daylight, casts a long shadow, wears black, and vanishes without moving? A mannequin? I ventured. Or something constructed to resemble one, Holmes replied. And here is where it becomes elegant. It appears at 12 past noon, is spotted by someone upstairs, someone who then leaves the window to summon others. By the time they return, it has vanished. But if it were pulled upward, by cord or pulley, from the inner face of the courtyard wall, then it would be gone by the time they looked again. Hidden behind the very house that gave them their vantage. We returned to the courtyard in the half-dark. Holmes traced the bricks along the western wall where ivy clung thickest. After a moment's inspection, he smiled thinly. "Look here," he said, drawing aside a section of ivy to reveal a small iron ring embedded in the stone. "And above, see the loop? Someone has rigged a simple drawer. The figure was raised and lowered like a theatre curtain." "And the figure itself?" I asked. "Likely constructed from cloth and straw or wood, designed to hold shape for a few minutes and then disappear at the tug of a rope. Very efficient, very controlled. And the time, 12 minutes past noon, is chosen not just for theatricality, but for light. The sundial shadow would mark the moment precisely. It's all measured, Watson. This entire illusion has been measured." At this, Holmes's tone darkened. But illusions serve to distract. The real purpose of this pantomime lies in what it conceals. That night, Holmes took no rest. He spent the hours before dawn in the attic, observing the courtyard through the window, testing the angles with a lantern and a small pocket mirror. I offered to relieve him more than once, but he would not hear of it. By morning, he was a gaunt silhouette in the growing light, his figure hunched at the window, eyes trained on the sun's creeping rise. At 11:45, he summoned me quietly. "It is nearly time," he said. "I have informed Lestrade. He and 2 plainclothes men are concealed in the garden behind the brick wall. When I give the signal, they will enter. You and I shall remain here, watching." "Watching for what?" "For who comes to collect the phantom." At 12 minutes past noon, the figure appeared. It was as the maid described, tall, black-coated, motionless. It stood beside the sundial just as before, and for a brief moment I felt the shiver of something uncanny. Holmes did not move. He simply waited. Below I heard the faint creak of a door. Then footsteps, quick, deliberate. A man emerged from the side pantry, one I had believed unused since the previous evening. He darted across the courtyard, reached into the ivy and tugged. The figure vanished upward in one fluid motion. Holmes flung open the window. "Now, Lestrade!" The gate burst open, and the man wheeled around, startled. But it was too late. Lestrade's men seized him before he could flee. Holmes and I descended at once, arriving just as the figure's hood was pulled back. It was Henry Beresford. He struggled, furious. "This is a mistake. I was set up." Holmes said nothing at first. He reached into Henry's coat and withdrew a length of coarse black cloth, matching the one from the pantry floor. "I knew you'd return for it," Holmes said quietly. "You built the illusion, Henry, but you also wrote the notes, disguised your handwriting, left just enough to suggest threat. You meant to scare your uncle, not harm him, not at first." Henry's face twisted. "He's a fraud. He speaks of justice, but he lies, hides money, makes deals with men twice as corrupt. I wanted to expose him, shake him. The shadow was just to rattle him, not—" Holmes's voice was cool. "Not what?" Henry faltered. "Not lead to—" The next part. I swear, I never planned what happened next. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Search the attic above the pantry. You'll find the frame of the figure, a pulley, and a length of cord. Also look behind the study bookshelf. There is more hidden there. Documents, perhaps. Letters Sir Alton would prefer unseen." Lestrade nodded grimly. "It seems your shadows hid more than straw men, Mr. Beresford." Holmes said nothing further, merely turning his back to the scene. We walked slowly through the courtyard, the sundial's shadow now stretching behind us. "You knew it was him," I said. "Not until last night," Holmes replied. "But the rope, the angle of vision, the mimicry of a threat without direct confrontation, it all bespoke youth, desperation, and ideology twisted into melodrama. What Henry feared most, Watson, was not being heard. And now he has spoken, loudly." He glanced back once more. "And the shadow he cast at noon," Holmes added quietly, "has reached farther than he imagined." Lestrade ordered Beresford to be taken indoors for questioning, and the courtyard, once cloaked in eerie silence, now thrummed with the activity of lawmen. Yet, despite the apparent conclusion, I noticed that Holmes remained still beside the sundial, his eyes scanning the brick wall and the line of ivy, as if the ghost of the mystery still lingered. "Something troubles you?" I said, stepping beside him. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, not looking at me. Henry Beresford confessed to staging the apparition and writing the anonymous notes, yet one element remains dissonant, one string plucked out of tune. "Which is?" "The note found this morning. The final warning. He waits at the hour of judgment. It was written using the same materials, true, and in the same disguised hand, but it was composed after Henry was under suspicion. Why would he continue the performance if he suspected we were watching?" I frowned. "You think someone else carried it forward?" "Not think, Watson. No." Holmes turned and made his way back inside, beckoning me to follow. We passed Winstanley in the hall, who was nervously speaking with the butler, and Holmes gave only a curt nod before ascending the stairs once again to the study window. The staging of the figure relied on timing, precision, and privacy, Holmes said, as he reached the upper floor. Someone besides Beresford had access to this room, someone who could see the courtyard, handle documents, and understand how best to create doubt. "The secretary?" I said. Holmes gave a half-smile. "Always return to the facts, Watson. When we first met Winstanley, he gave us the map, the drawing of the courtyard, marked precisely at the spot where the figure appeared. That diagram was created before our arrival, possibly before the first figure was even reported. A curious thing for a secretary to prepare." He crossed to the writing desk and opened the middle drawer. Within it, everything appeared in order. Stationery, blotters, a small stack of copied correspondence. But Holmes lifted the blotter again and held it to the light. This time, a different impression revealed itself. The words "sundial, remove" after third showing. Holmes smiled coldly. He prepared to dismantle the illusion, but Henry acted first. The performance became a two-man play without either fully trusting the other. We left the study at once and made our way to the parlour where Lestrade stood, reviewing Henry's written statement. Winstanley hovered nearby, hands clasped, his expression drawn and pale. "Inspector," Holmes said, "I would ask you to detain one additional party." Lestrade blinked. "Another? On what charge?" "Conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. Mr. Edgar Winstanley helped conceive the illusion, crafted the schedule, and planted the final note, likely to prolong the panic and discredit Sir Alton before Henry lost his nerve." Winstanley turned slowly, his face blank. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Holmes said. "You were the one who first came to me with a map already drawn. You had access to the study, and when I found the spyglass impressions on the blotter, the final note matched pressure from your dominant hand. You wrote with a feigned tremble, a clever touch, but the angle of the pen's drag betrayed you." Winstanley looked from Holmes to Lestrade, calculating. "I wanted the truth to come out," he said quietly. "Sir Alton's campaign is built on deception. I tried to convince Henry to confront his uncle directly, but he only wanted to frighten him. I added just enough drama to ensure it would spiral. I wanted it exposed, nothing more." Holmes regarded him coldly. "You used a young man's anger to mask your own ambitions, and you would have allowed him to take the fall had he not confessed." Lestrade, to his credit, acted at once, motioning his men to escort Winstanley to the adjoining room. I noticed Henry, seated nearby, turn his face away as Winstanley passed. Holmes remained silent for some time. Then, in a low voice only I could hear, he said, "Even among reformers, deceit finds its natural home." When the house had quieted again, we took a final walk through the study. Holmes paused before the shelves where the final documents had been hidden. A series of letters and records implicating Sir Alton in several dubious dealings. They had been well concealed behind a false board triggered by a slight pressure on the top shelf. "So," I said, "the shadow was a metaphor all along." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "And not just metaphorical. The figure in the courtyard served as a smokescreen for a deeper truth, the corruption Henry suspected, the evidence Winstanley sought to reveal. But had they come to you with that directly, they believed no one would listen. So they crafted a drama, and in doing so risked lives, reputations, and liberty." We returned to the sitting room where Sir Alton sat, ashen and silent. Holmes offered no comfort, only a brief nod. "I suspect, sir, you will wish to resign quietly and with dignity," he said. Sir Alton did not reply. He stared at the cold grate of the fireplace, the weight of consequences settling at last. Outside, the day had shifted. The noonday light had faded to grey, and the shadow cast by the sundial now reached far past its usual arc. Holmes and I stepped into the street, the crisp air bracing after the stifling tension inside. "There are many forms of justice," Holmes said. "Not all are delivered in court." "And what of Henry?" I asked. "He will face censure," Holmes said, "but he may yet be saved by the clarity of his confession. I believe his intentions, while naive, were rooted in truth." We walked in silence for a few minutes. Then Holmes added, "Shadows do not exist without light, Watson. This case, like so many others, was not about what we saw, but where we failed to look." And with that, he hailed a cab, and we turned toward Baker Street, the puzzle now behind us, its darkness dispersed, but the impression of its silhouette still lingering faintly in the mind. The cab rolled steadily through the soot-lined streets of Lambeth, and for a time Holmes said nothing, content to let the din of clattering wheels and London's hum fill the space between us. His hat was drawn low, his eyes fixed not on the view, but inward, as if replaying the sequence of events again, shifting one piece, testing the fit of another. "Holmes," I said after some minutes, "if Winstanley planted the final note and helped stage the figure, why deliver the case to you at all? Why risk discovery?" He stirred, then gave a faint nod, acknowledging the logic of my question. Because he needed legitimacy, Watson. A staged haunting in the house of a sitting MP would risk being dismissed as hysteria or mischief. But if I believed in it, even briefly, it would draw attention. He wanted the story to grow, to spread, and he knew that I would dissect it, layer by layer, until the foundation cracked. So he baited you into the puzzle? Precisely. He could control the narrative if he controlled the instigator, but he underestimated two things. Holmes's voice sharpened. First, that Henry would break, too soon and too honestly, and second, that I was never taken in by shadows alone. I deal in substance. We turned on to Baker Street just as the clouds began to roll low and leaden, threatening rain. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual mixture of fondness and resigned irritation. Holmes had asked her to keep tea hot since the previous afternoon. As we shed our coats and stepped into the sitting room, the familiar scent of tobacco and paper welcomed us home. I had just taken my seat near the fire when Holmes crossed to his desk and removed the final note from his coat pocket. He held it in the light, turning it slightly, then reached for a small crystal bottle containing a trace of reagent. "You still suspect it?" I asked. He gave a slight shrug. "I never allow the surface to blind me to the possibility of deeper manipulation. Winstanley wrote the message, yes, but who suggested the words? Who provided the phrasing that turned a student's protest into a staged haunting?" He applied the reagent to the note and waited. Slowly, faint characters began to emerge along the edge of the page. Holmes leaned closer. "A watermark," he said. "No, more than that. A faint emblem, stylized scales of justice, not from Winstanley's usual paper." I rose, peering over his shoulder. "That it wasn't his stationery?" "Not originally. This paper came from a specific parliamentary correspondence set, limited to inner cabinet ministers." Holmes stood, abruptly, pacing. "We assumed Winstanley and Henry acted independently, but I believe now someone else, someone inside Parliament, saw advantage in their scheme and guided it. They nudged them toward a breaking point. If Sir Alton fell, so too would any proposal he championed." "A political rival?" "More likely a cautious ally," Holmes murmured. "One who found Sir Alton's exposure too valuable to ignore, but too risky to execute openly." He moved to the shelves, scanning the spines until he retrieved a small ledger. There were two bills Sir Alton was about to introduce, one on public prison audits, highly controversial, the other on naval contract reform. Both threatened significant financial interests. He handed me the ledger and tapped the margin. "Note this name, Lord Tobias Greer, a quiet man, seldom in the public eye, but he sits on the Naval Appropriations Committee, and his name appears in letters Sir Alton had hidden, letters implicating him in a covert contract scheme." "So you think Greer encouraged Winstanley to act?" "Perhaps not directly, but a whisper here, a suggestion there. What better way to remove a threat than to let your enemies destroy themselves with their own outrage?" Holmes stepped to the window. The rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then steadier. Across the glass the city blurred, as though even its outlines refused to stand still. He stood quietly, watching the people below vanish beneath umbrellas and hurried coats. "I dislike conspiracies, Watson," he said finally. "They are messy and rarely as coherent as their architects believe. But what troubles me is not the act of exposure, it's the orchestration. Someone has used a young man's sense of justice and a clerk's ambition to silence a voice in Parliament and to bury truths far deeper than Sir Alton's hypocrisy. And what can be done? I can do what I always do." Holmes turned back from the window, his voice sharpened now. "Illuminate the unseen, trace the threads backward. We may have solved the performance, but now we must find the playwright." He took his seat, fingers steepled once more. Greer's name appeared in a letter Beresford never saw. Winstanley mentioned it only once, and then dismissed it. "I shall pay a visit to Lord Greer's club. Meanwhile, I'll need you to write to Mycroft, request any internal memos from the Naval Committee over the past 2 months, especially those referencing audit resistance or Beresford." I reached for the notepad without hesitation. When Holmes began to chase unseen connections, the process was inexorable. I had seen it before, in the Milverton affair, in the cryptic unravelling of the Bruce Partington plans. Some shadows, it seemed, reached farther than even the sundial had measured. Holmes glanced again at the note, now curling at the edges from chemical exposure. "A message," he said quietly, "left not to warn, but to invite inquiry." He turned to me, a glint of steel returning to his eyes. "The case, my dear Watson," he said with unmistakable finality, "is not yet closed." The following morning broke grey and overcast, the kind of weather that suited Holmes best. He dressed with particular precision, donning his charcoal grey frock coat, a soft scarf at the collar, and the dark gloves he only wore when matters extended beyond curiosity and into confrontation. He took only a single folded note in his pocket, his ticket, he claimed, to enter the theatre of politics without a formal invitation. "I shall visit the Diogenes Club," he said as we stood by the door, "and from there a quiet detour to Lord Greer's gentlemanly sanctum on Pall Mall. Mycroft's assistance may prove necessary, and at worst, informative." "You believe Greer was the author of the larger deception?" I asked. Holmes hesitated on the threshold. "No, not the author, but very possibly the editor. The one who saw a volatile manuscript in Winstanley and Beresford and annotated it to serve his own ends." He gave me a brisk nod and departed without further elaboration. Left behind, I attended to Holmes's instructions. I penned a carefully phrased inquiry to Mycroft, citing Holmes's request for internal committee records, and arranged for its immediate dispatch via messenger. I also returned briefly to Sir Alton's residence under the guise of collecting Holmes's forgotten walking stick. There I observed that Henry Beresford had been moved to his uncle's country estate, partly for discretion, partly for protection. Winstanley remained under detainment, guarded quietly at Scotland Yard. Neither had yet faced formal charges. I was back at Baker Street by early afternoon when Holmes returned, shedding his coat and gloves with the brisk economy of a man who had been walking in circles of power. "Well?" I asked, as he threw himself into his chair and reached for the Persian slipper of tobacco. "It's always revealing," he said, packing his pipe with deliberate care. "How quiet the powerful become when their names appear on documents not meant for the public eye." He struck a match, inhaled once, and exhaled a ribbon of smoke. Greer was calm, too calm. He admitted nothing, of course. But when I mentioned Beresford's confession and Winstanley's impending testimony, I noted the briefest pause, not of surprise, but of recalibration, as though he were adjusting to a piece removed from the board earlier than anticipated. "Then he was involved?" "Indirectly," Holmes replied. He did not construct the stage, but he very likely provided the backdrop. Greer's correspondence was among the letters hidden by Sir Alton, and not by chance. The missing portion of the puzzle, Watson, is this. Why would a man like Sir Alton hide damning correspondence rather than destroy it? To keep leverage, I said, instinctively. Holmes smiled. Precisely. Greer and Alton were not rivals, they were co-conspirators, until Alton threatened to turn on him, likely under pressure from Beresford or internal inquiry. That made Alton a liability, and what does one do with a liability? Discredit it, I said. Exactly, the perfect method. Let the man's own household unravel him, feed the flames of discontent already rising. Winstanley and Beresford were primed for such influence, idealists but inexperienced. Greer needed only to suggest a path forward, a whisper here, a misdirected envelope there. The notes became more menacing, the figure more precise, and behind it all, Greer's own position grew ever more secure as Alton teetered. But now it has begun to collapse, I said. It has, Holmes confirmed. And Greer is preparing for the fallout. He's begun distancing himself. I expect a quiet illness will take him abroad soon. You'll see his name vanish from committee records before the year's end. He stood again and began pacing, his energy returning with the satisfaction of the chase. There remains one loose thread, he said, pausing beside the window, the one actor whose role is still uncertain. He turned to face me. Langham? I blinked. Henry's friend? Exactly. He arrived conveniently with just enough information to lend credibility to Beresford's possession of the spyglass. But why would Langham risk following Holmes himself unless to ensure the story reached a very specific destination? You think Langham was working for Greer? Or against him, Holmes said. That is what I mean to determine. I've arranged for us to meet this evening. The hours until dusk passed in tense reflection. Holmes remained at his desk, reviewing the notes, cross-referencing the handwriting samples once more. At 7, we made our way to the small cafe in Bloomsbury where Holmes had instructed Langham to appear. It was a quiet place, modest and smoky, populated mostly by students and clerks nursing weak coffee and strong convictions. Langham arrived precisely on time. He looked nervous but not frightened. He greeted Holmes with a hesitant nod, glanced at me and sat. You said you wanted to talk? I did, Holmes said smoothly. Tell me again how you came to possess the information about the spyglass. Langham's eyes flicked sideways. I saw Henry with it one night. He let me try it. I remembered the maker's name. And you came to Baker Street. Why? Langham hesitated. Because I was afraid something had gone wrong. Henry wasn't answering his letters, and I knew he'd done something foolish. Holmes was silent a moment, then leaned forward. You were paid, weren't you? Langham stiffened. Not by Greer, Holmes continued. By someone else. Perhaps an assistant in another office. You were told to encourage Henry's fears. Help him escalate the plan, and when it began to veer off course, you came to me, not to help Henry, but to ensure your own hands remained clean. Langham's voice cracked. I didn't know how far it would go. I thought it was just theatre, I swear it. Holmes rose. I believe you, but I also believe you'll need to testify. What you saw, what you heard, you're the last witness between Greer's shadow and the light. Langham nodded slowly, shame creeping into his face. Will I be charged? That's not for me to decide, Holmes said. But truth tends to favour those who confess before they're cornered. He turned and walked out into the chill evening. I followed, and for a time we said nothing. Then as we reached the curb, Holmes glanced at me. We chased the shadow, Watson, he said, But it is the silhouette cast by power that most often misleads. Greer may fade, but the structure remains. A quiet stage, ever waiting for its next performance. And so we return to Baker Street, the city once more closing around us, not with answers, but with the silence that follows when a secret loses its voice. The wind had risen by the time we reached Baker Street, threading through the shutters and rattling the panes with a restlessness that echoed Holmes's own mood. He moved quickly across the sitting room, removing his coat and returning at once to the desk, where he retrieved the bundle of papers seized from Sir Alton's study. I poured 2 cups of tea in silence, knowing better than to interrupt him mid-immersion. Langham's confession had given shape to the suspicion, but Holmes was after its architecture, the full scaffolding that supported Greer's influence. The problem was not just a scandal or a scheme, it was a structure that had allowed the manipulation of public servants, young radicals and private intentions into one seamless mechanism of political assassination. The illusion had ended in the courtyard, but the deception ran far deeper. Holmes opened one of the letters and held it against the firelight, revealing faint notations made in red pencil, subtle corrections, inserted figures, a rephrased line here, a circled clause there. "Do you see this, Watson?" I moved to his side. "These are amendments, additions inserted after the original drafting. And here, look at the handwriting, it's not Sir Alton's." "Greer's?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No, but someone close to him, a staff intermediary likely, someone who redrafted the language of these letters before they were sent, perhaps even before they were intended to be signed." He moved to the index cabinet, rifling swiftly through clippings, until he produced an article from the Parliamentary Record, dated 4 months earlier. He laid it beside the letter. The phrasing in the 3rd paragraph of the article matched almost identically the red pencil annotations in the letter. "Ghostwriting," Holmes said softly. "The anonymous pen behind both public defence and private betrayal." "Do you know who wrote it?" I asked. "I have a strong suspicion," he replied. "And if I'm right, he is more dangerous than Greer, because he does not operate from position or power, but from invisibility." He returned to the desk, quickly drafting 2 telegrams, one to Mycroft, requesting any available notes on Lord Greer's secretarial staff, and another to a contact within the Home Office known only to me as M. The requests were specific: employment records, written samples, private connections. He sealed the envelopes and handed them to me. I understood at once and left to see them safely dispatched through secure hands. By the time I returned, the rain had begun in earnest. Holmes had not moved from his place by the desk, and the fire had sunk into embers. His pipe lay untouched on the table. "News?" I asked. "I have had a reply from Mycroft," he said, holding up a slip of paper. "Greer's private correspondence and speeches were filtered, almost entirely, through a single man." He handed me the note. The name was unfamiliar. "Julian Hext," I read aloud. Holmes nodded. "Little known publicly, a policy advisor in name only, but a writer, a framer, a constructor of language. Mycroft notes that Hext has remained in Greer's shadow for over a decade, drafting proposals, editing statements, rewriting entire stances when needed, and always quietly. But why would a man like that risk exposure?" "Because Hext is not merely an accomplice," Holmes said. "He is an architect. Greer was the shield, but Hext is the blade. I suspect he manipulated not just the wording of letters, but the very existence of the scandal. He saw Winstanley's idealism, Henry's desperation, Sir Alton's guilt, and Greer's ambition, and moved each according to purpose." He began to pace, slowly, the way he did only when the final wall was beginning to fall. "I must speak to him, Watson, tonight." We don't know where he is, I said. Oh, but we do, Holmes replied. Or rather, we know where he must be. He moved to the shelf, withdrew a worn address book, and flipped it open. He frequents the Athenaeum, not for social reasons, but to access private archives. He's there under a guest pass issued through Greer's influence. If he is still working to clean the trail behind Greer, he will be there tonight, ensuring no loose ends remain. 20 minutes later, we stepped into the cloistered hush of the Athenaeum Club, the doorman glancing at Holmes with just enough recognition to allow our entrance without question. We moved swiftly through the reading rooms, past the dimly lit alcoves of scholars and political men in whispered conference. Holmes stopped beside a panelled doorway marked Archives, Private Members Only. He gestured for silence, then pressed the door open, with the faintest creak. Inside, under the green-shaded light of a reading lamp, sat a man in his early 50s, lean and composed, his long fingers resting upon a stack of documents. He did not startle as we entered. Instead, he removed his glasses slowly and looked up with an expression of faint curiosity. "Mr. Hext," Holmes said, "how fortunate to find you." Julian Hext did not rise. His gaze settled on Holmes with cold detachment. "You presume much, Mr. Holmes?" "And you conceal more," Holmes replied calmly. "The shadow seen at noon was your creation, not the figure itself, but the idea. You ghost-wrote the entire play." "I ghost-write everything," Hext said mildly. "That is my profession." "But this one wasn't printed," Holmes said. "It was staged." "And you ensured it reached its audience." Hext gave a thin smile. "I offered a direction. It was Winstanley who performed it, Henry who provided the motive, Sir Alton who provided the secret." "You know how theatre works, Mr. Holmes. The best playwright is invisible." Holmes stepped closer. "Your signature is everywhere, Mr. Hext, in the phrasing of the notes, in the staged suspense, in the timing. 12 minutes past noon. All clocked, precise, symbolic." "They needed a reckoning," Hext said softly. "I simply gave them structure. I merely composed what they already wanted to express." "But you ensured it imploded," Holmes countered. "Not just exposed, destroyed. A scandal orchestrated from the margins." Hext folded his hands. "Then arrest me. You'll find I've broken no law." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, "Perhaps not. But shadows do not need a courtroom to be measured, only light." Hext's gaze narrowed. Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson." We left without another word, the door clicking softly shut behind us. Outside, the rain had stopped. The gas lamps flickered against puddles that reflected their glow like distant stars. Holmes walked in silence for several streets before speaking. "There will be no trial, Watson, no charges. Hext wrote the story too carefully for that. But we have turned the light on him. The truth will reach the right hands." "And Greer?" "He will vanish. He may surface later, elsewhere, diminished. But he will never again move unseen in Parliament." "And the others?" "Winstanley may yet serve something useful. Beresford, perhaps in time he'll learn what justice means without performance." Holmes looked up at the sky, pale and uncertain in the gaslight. "But it is Hext I'll remember, Watson. Not for what he did, but for what he revealed. That the most dangerous players are not those who lead, but those who script what others believe to be their own thoughts." And with that, we turned toward home, the story nearly finished, though the shadows it had cast would take far longer to fade. We returned to Baker Street well past midnight, the lamplight softening the edges of the room as if reluctant to disturb the gravity of what had passed.
Holmes moved with no sense of triumph, only a purposeful stillness that seemed to weigh more heavily than exhaustion. He discarded his coat and gloves in silence, poured himself a measure of brandy, and remained standing by the hearth, unmoving, for a long moment. "You did not press Hext further," I said. "You could have forced more from him." "There was no need," Holmes replied. "He gave us the only thing he ever intended to reveal, his authorship. It was a confession in everything but name. But a man like Julian Hext does not fear exposure. He thrives in the knowledge that while others act in broad daylight, he exists in the twilight, where intentions are less scrutinized and responsibility can be safely deflected." I seated myself across from him. "Then what now? If Greer fades and Hext slips into the background once more, does the case simply end?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "It ends, yes, but like a chapter closed, not a story concluded. What we uncovered was not a murder, nor even a crime by conventional measure. We discovered an arrangement, a method of thought manipulation embedded in political maneuvering, and in such cases the goal is not prosecution, it is interruption." He sipped the brandy, eyes narrowed against the heat of it. "The machinery that moved behind Winstanley and Beresford still turns, Watson. There will be others like them, but now they will hesitate. And hesitation is often the most powerful disruption of all." The fire crackled, dry and hollow. I found myself recalling the earlier days of our partnership, cases resolved with pistols drawn or poisons revealed, but this was subtler and somehow more unnerving. There had been no body, no smoking gun, and yet a ruinous act had unfolded across Parliament, constructed not with violence, but with suggestion. Holmes turned toward his violin, then paused and instead retrieved the final note, the one bearing Hext's influence, from his desk. He studied it again, then placed it flat upon the table. "He waits at the hour of judgment," he repeated aloud, a phrase not merely ominous but theatrical, designed to evoke something ancient and fatal. That was the key to the whole ruse. It invited paranoia, it stirred imagination, and it created an inevitability that those involved could not resist. He tapped the edge of the paper. "This is no longer evidence, it is a lesson." There came a knock at the door. Holmes stiffened, then moved swiftly to answer. It was unusual to receive visitors at such an hour, and more unusual still for Holmes to respond personally. A messenger stood in the hall, breathless and rain-soaked, holding a sealed envelope. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, "from the Home Office." Holmes took it, nodded once, and closed the door behind him. He opened the envelope with a flick of his nail, read the contents, and handed the paper silently to me. The message was short. "Langham is missing. Disappeared from his residence 2 hours after your meeting. His rooms were found in disarray. Investigating. M." I looked up sharply. "He's been silenced," I said. "Or protected," Holmes replied. "Perhaps both. A man like Hext would not allow a key player to wander unmonitored. If Langham knew more than he revealed to us, or worse, if he left anything behind, then Hext would not risk him speaking again." Holmes turned and began to pace. "It was no coincidence Langham came to us. He was placed, Watson, at first to guide the narrative, later to ensure its closure. But something about our conversation changed the calculus. Langham began to question the role he'd played, and that made him dangerous." "You don't believe he ran?" I asked. Holmes paused at the window. "No, he was not clever enough to hide himself so completely. Someone intervened, but they did so carefully, without noise, without notice." He looked back at me, his expression sharpening. "Langham's disappearance confirms what I suspected. Hext is not finished. He is simply shifting.
The figure in the courtyard was the first act. The real performance has only just begun. The room fell into stillness, broken only by the low groan of the wind. Holmes resumed pacing, restless energy creeping back into his limbs. He retrieved a map of central London and laid it flat on the table, marking 3 locations in pencil: Sir Alton's townhouse, the Athenaeum Club, and Langham's boarding house in South Kensington. "There is a triangle of movement here," he said, "each point connected by secrecy, each used to pass messages, scripts, and decisions. Somewhere in that path, Hext left a trail. He is careful, but no man is perfect, especially when he believes he has won." He stared at the marks, then looked up. "Tomorrow, we go to Langham's rooms." "You think we'll find something?" "I think we must," Holmes said quietly. "Because if Hext is not working alone, if he has begun to build something larger, then the shadow seen at noon was not just a symbol, it was a rehearsal." And so the silence returned, filled only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the awareness that while the illusion had been unmasked, the hand behind the curtain was still writing. The next morning found us already en route to South Kensington, the fog hanging low over the rooftops like the final curtain of some silent performance. Holmes was grimly composed beside me in the cab, his hands folded, the brim of his hat pulled low. He had slept no more than an hour, though one would never have guessed it. His eyes were keen, scanning the misted streets as though the city itself might confess if only observed long enough. Langham's disappearance had redrawn the shape of the case. What had once appeared a self-contained deception had begun to bleed into something larger, more deliberate. If Langham had been silenced, it meant Hext, or whoever stood above him, feared the truth surfacing. That fear, Holmes had remarked, was their one misstep. We arrived at Langham's residence shortly after 8, a narrow 3-story terrace wedged between 2 shops that had not yet opened for the day. The landlady, a severe woman with strong features and a distrustful air, met us at the door. "I told the constable all I know," she said. Mr. Langham returned late, just before 11, I'd say, looked agitated, said he was going out again, but left without his coat. Never came back. Found his room in a state the next morning. I don't like it. "You say he left again?" Holmes asked. "And you saw him go?" "I heard the front door open, but I didn't see him." "Could have been him, could have been someone else." Holmes gave a polite nod and requested to be shown the room. She led us up the narrow stairs, the wood creaking beneath our feet, and opened a door on the second landing. The space inside was modest, bare floorboards, a small writing desk, a narrow bed, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. The curtains were drawn, and the air held a faint scent of old paper and something sharper, like oil or ink. Holmes entered without hesitation. He stood still for a moment, scanning the space with the deliberate slowness that I had come to recognize not as hesitancy, but as focus. "There," he said, pointing to the writing desk. Someone opened the drawers in haste, note the scratch on the interior, where the wood's been gouged by a fingernail, but nothing was taken. He moved to the bed, crouched beside it, and retrieved a scrap of paper barely visible beneath the frame. He held it to the window. Part of a torn envelope, no stamp, no address, delivered by hand. And see here? He indicated a small, smeared fingerprint on the edge. Ink, still damp at the time it was handled. He stepped to the fireplace and stooped. "Watson." I crossed the room as he lifted a fragment of charred paper from the grate. The fire had long gone out, but the embers had done their work. Holmes examined the fragment. "Just legible," he murmured. "Ensure nothing survives. Burn all script. H. The rest is gone. H for Hext, almost certainly. Langham was told to destroy his correspondence, likely panicked, burned what he could, but something stopped him. He stood and turned back to the writing desk. "There's something else." "He left in a hurry," the landlady said, "but didn't take his coat." Odd, unless he had no choice. He opened the wardrobe, scanned it, then pushed it aside to reveal a narrow crawl space built between the inner walls. From it, Holmes drew a canvas satchel. He placed it on the desk and unbuckled the clasp. Inside were several folded pages, unburnt, and a small bound notebook. Holmes's expression grew taut as he examined the first page. "Correspondence between Langham and Winstanley," he said. "Dates, times, instructions. But look here, this passage is not from Winstanley." He handed me the page. The tone was different, more refined, more commanding. Let the threat appear inevitable. The spectacle must seem spontaneous. If fear is to serve purpose, it must be authored by the audience. "The philosophy of control," Holmes said. "Winstanley could never have written this. These are Hext's words, or the words of whoever gave Hext his methods." I turned the page. The notes continued, references to specific speeches, letters, even appointments within the Naval Committee. Langham had been a courier, yes, but also a recorder. He had compiled more than he knew. Holmes's attention had returned to the notebook. His brow furrowed as he flipped to the last entry. "Read it," he said, handing it to me. "They've gone too far. Hext said it was about disruption, not destruction. But Alton's collapse won't be the last. They're planning something larger." He showed me a list: names, constituencies, pressure points. "If I disappear, find the notebook. Find the rest. Tell Holmes he's the only one they fear." I looked up sharply. "He tried to warn us." "He did," Holmes said, "and for it, he's likely dead, or buried so deeply he may never resurface." He placed the notebook gently into his coat and turned to me, his voice low. "This is no longer about Beresford or Winstanley. This was a test, a staging ground for something else. Hext was not acting for Greer alone. There is a deeper structure, faceless, quiet and deliberate. They use theatre as weaponry, Watson, and their audience is the government." We left the room in silence. The landlady watched us go with suspicion, but Holmes offered no word. Outside, the fog had thickened, the morning dim despite the hour. Holmes paused at the curb, the satchel beneath his arm, his eyes scanning the sky. "They have names," he said, "and now we have them too." "But to what end?" "To anticipate the next shadow," he replied. "Because whatever's coming, Watson, it won't be seen at noon. It will be seen too late." And with that, he hailed a cab, and we rode toward the one place left to begin deciphering the list Langham had died to preserve, the office of Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft received us without surprise. He seldom betrayed emotion, but there was a tightness in his features as he took the satchel from Holmes's hand and examined its contents in silence. We sat in a secluded chamber of the Diogenes Club, the fire lit but untouched, and not another soul present beyond the three of us. Holmes leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled, while I remained near the window, watching the faint silhouette of London traffic pass behind the frost-clouded panes. "It was all there," Holmes said. "Langham's notes, the correspondence, the final entry, names, dates and patterns. Hext was not just an opportunist. He was acting within a greater scheme, not of party politics, but something far more deliberate, a long game." Mycroft closed the satchel, resting his fingertips atop it. "The names on this list," he murmured. "Some are known to us, others less so, but there is a disturbing unity to their placement. Each occupies a point of influence, not of policy, but of perception. Editors, clerks, advisers, shadow makers." Holmes's voice was calm but sharp. They construct the atmosphere in which decisions are interpreted. They don't change what is done, they change how it is understood. The ghost in the courtyard was just the beginning. They intend to manufacture doubt, orchestrate outrage, and control the tempo of reform through illusion. I turned from the window. You believe it will escalate? Mycroft's glance flicked toward me, then returned to Holmes. It already has. This. He tapped the satchel. This is only one thread, but with it we can begin to unravel the design. Holmes rose and paced once, then stopped at the hearth. You'll act on it? I will, Mycroft replied. Quietly. Public disruption would serve them better than silence. They thrive on spectacle. I shall give them none. There was a pause then, heavy, thoughtful. Holmes finally spoke again. What of Hext? He will not be charged, Mycroft said, unflinching. But he will be watched closely. His utility has expired, and men like him seldom survive irrelevance. He may vanish on his own terms. Holmes nodded, though there was no triumph in it. And Langham? I asked quietly. Mycroft's expression shifted just enough. If he is found, he will be protected. If he is gone, then he will not be forgotten. Holmes stepped forward and extended his hand across the table, something he rarely did. The war is not of guns, Mycroft, not this one. It's of suggestion. See that you don't lose it. Mycroft accepted the gesture, their eyes locking for one long moment. We never do, he said simply. That night, as Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the weight of the case hung over us, not as a burden, but as a shadow of something still forming. The candle-lit parlour, with its comfortable clutter and familiar silence, felt suddenly distant from the mechanisms we had glimpsed. The great stage upon which Langham had played his part was still open, its next act already being whispered into the wings. Holmes took up his violin but played no more than a phrase. He set it down again and turned to me. You saw what it was, Watson, not a case, but a signal. A demonstration of what can be shaped when the mind is guided rather than informed. And can it be stopped? I asked. No, Holmes said, but it can be seen, and seeing, we can prepare. He fell quiet then, his gaze turning toward the rain-streaked window, and so the case of the shadow, seen at noon, reached its end, an end without arrest, without a claim, without certainty, only clarity that the greatest manipulations are those dressed in our own expectations, that the most dangerous crimes may be the ones never written into law, and that Sherlock Holmes, though victorious once more, knew the curtain had not fallen, only risen on a darker, wider stage. We never spoke of it again, but the list remained, locked in a drawer, watched over in silence. And somewhere in London the shadows waited for their next cue.